All right, good morning. We're going to be looking at the Korean War in this lecture. Sorry, I'm getting some email from work. Let me shut that off. So let's dive right in. Go to sharing. All right. Now, when we left off last time, we had been talking about NSC 68, and remember these recommendations that have been part of NSC 68. Develop the bomb, build up conventional armed force, increase taxes, collective security, propagandize the American people. Initially, when Congress was given these recommendations, they weren't particularly enthusiastic about them. And much of NSC 68, these recommendations probably would not have gone through without the Korean War. As the Secretary of State, Dean Eckenson, put it, Korea came along and saved us. So let's take a look at the Korean War because it's going to have a profound impact on American foreign policy. Now, let me give you some background here. Of course, back in 1910, Korea had been taken over by Japan. That was after the Taft-Katsura Treaty. And Korea remained part of Japan's empire until after World War II. Now, in the closing days of World War II, Northern Korea was liberated. I don't type any better on this computer than I do on the one at home. Northern Korea was liberated by the Soviets, and Southern Korea was liberated by the United States. And attempts at reunification failed. And so eventually, the country was divided at the 38th parallel, which is where Korea is still divided today, North and South Korea. A war broke out between 1946 and 1950 between the two Koreas. This war was fought with very little international coverage. Even though 100,000 Koreans died in this war, very few people knew about it. Now, the war stopped in 1950, but it was not an end in any way to the war. The leader of North Korea was Kim Il-Sung, who is the grandfather of North Korea's current leader. And Sung wanted to renew the attack in 1950. However, he needed permission from Stalin, and so he actually journeyed to Moscow in order to get support from Stalin and permission for the invasion. However, Stalin told Kim that, quote, if you get kicked in the teeth, I will not lift a finger to help you. Okay? You will have to ask Mao for help. And this turned out to pretty much be the case. Once North Korea found itself being beaten by the United States, and we'll get to this in a moment. Stalin did nothing to help North Korea. All the help came from China's Mao Zedong, who we should probably introduce here. There are a number of ways to spell Mao's last name. He was the communist leader of China who had taken power in 1949. That was one of the two shocks of 1949 that I talked about in lecture number 2. And so again, Stalin says, if you want to attack South Korea, be my guest. But if you get in trouble, you're going to have to go to Mao for any help. I'm not going to help you. And that turned out to be the truth. June 25th, 1950, North Korea invades South Korea. This was seen as part of the larger communist threat to take over the world. Remember, one of the assumptions being made about the Soviet Union is that the Soviets wished to take over the entire world, and that all communist movements were directed by the Soviet Union. And so this would be an example, North Korea invading South Korea, of communism attempting to take over another section of the war. And so the United States is going to help out. However, the United States will never officially declare war on Korea. Truman, instead of going through Congress and getting a declaration of war, Truman will work through the United Nations. And so technically the Korean War is referred to as a police action, not a war by the United States. Even though the U.S. 50% of ground troops, 86% of naval power, and 93% air power, it's still going to be a United Nations police action. So the British will be there. The Australians, I know Turkey sends some people. I think the Italians send some people. The French do not, because France is busy in Vietnam, losing that war, a story we'll get to eventually. But again, there's never an official declaration of war by the United States. And as you can see here, the war goes pretty badly for South Korea. North Korea invading, you can follow these arrows coming down. And this occurs pretty quickly. Where South Korea and the U.S. Army forces that are there are pushed back into what is called Pusan in this area. Rather than fight their way back out of this perimeter, the United States made the decision to invade the port of Incheon, which is up here. All right, so the U.S. decides it's going to, instead of fight their way back out of this perimeter, they're going to land at Incheon and fight their way down. And so these are just the Incheon landings. This is all done by Douglas MacArthur, this is pretty much his last great achievement. And you can see the landings at Incheon. And very quickly, the the United Nations, is able to push North Korean forces back. Very, very quickly. Okay. By November of 1950, probably about mid-November, this is where United Nations forces have gotten to. Now, the Chinese are not particularly enthusiastic about all of these Americans coming to their border. The Yalu River is the border that separates North Korea from South Korea. The Chinese said, and I quote, "We will not sit back with folded hands and let the Americans come to our border." MacArthur called the Chinese paper tigers and felt that China, because China did not have any air power, that China would not be a threat to American forces. In late October of 1950, sorry, let me roll that back. Chinese forces began crossing the border. U.S. servicemen began capturing Chinese troops sort of in this area. And the Chinese troops, when they were interrogated, all said the same thing. There's a lot more troops just across the border. But MacArthur didn't want to hear that. MacArthur had already decided what the situation was without listening to the intelligence, okay, which is backwards. You listen to the intelligence, then you draw up a picture of what's happening. Again, MacArthur had already drawn up the picture, and any intelligence that did not fit the picture was simply discarded. Late November, 300,000 Chinese troops swarm across the border. And 3 weeks later, they had pushed, this is late November right here, in 3 weeks, they had pushed UN forces back below the 38th parallel. Now, how did China do this? Okay, how was China able to defeat U.S. UN forces? First of all, the Chinese had an endless supply of men. Okay, that 300,000 was just the initial wave. It kept coming after that. Okay, you talk to those old Korean vets, and they will talk about an endless wave of Chinese coming at them. 2, attacked at night. U.S. forces at this time were not trained for combat at night, and so the Chinese frequently attacked on moonless nights. So pitch black outside, and all of a sudden you hear that whistle blow, and here come the Chinese. And the only light are explosions, tracer fire, and you don't know if the foxhole to your left has been overrun. You don't know if the foxhole to your right. You don't know if the foxhole's behind you. You are simply in your foxhole, basically fighting blind without knowing what's going on around you. And it would be like that for hours on end. The Chinese took to the high ground while UN forces stuck to the roads. And so on more than one occasion, the Chinese were able to create bottlenecks in traffic by basically striking at the head. You know, you might have a big convoy of military vehicles. Well, if you blow up a bunch at the beginning, at the head of the convoy, that's going to create a traffic jam. And then you can just keep attacking the traffic jam. And then one of those traffic jams, it was 17 miles long. And eventually, American forces simply got out of their vehicles and had to crawl, sometimes crawling underneath tanks for miles on end in order to escape the attacks. Once this occurred, again, it only took 3 weeks for the Chinese to push back. And the war will pretty much stalemate in this area along the 38th parallel for the rest of the war. Truman basically had two options at this point. One was to do what MacArthur wanted to do and go nuclear. Okay. It later came out that MacArthur had a plan that would involve dropping 30 atomic bombs on Manchuria, as part of southern China. And that's just for a starter. Another 100,000 troops coming from Taiwan, dropping basically radioactive material on China. Not a nuclear, but the what's called cobalt, just dropping it out of planes onto China's cities. Okay, that seems a little excessive. The second option is to accept what's going to come to be called a limited war. And that's a phrase we're going to see a lot. As far as MacArthur goes, MacArthur publicly criticized Truman, and Truman fired him. All right. If you want to publicly criticize the president, you're going to accept the consequences regardless of who you are. That's what McChrystal found out back in Afghanistan, back in the I forget when it was, 2011, 2010. So we're not going to go nuclear. MacArthur gets fired. So we're going with a limited war. What does limited war mean? Well, basically it means a stalemate. We can't defeat the Chinese in a conventional war with tanks and planes and bullets and manpower. But we can't go nuclear either, because if we go nuclear, the Soviet Union might go nuclear. Okay. And then with the threat of atomic war, total victory is no longer an option. And this is something the United States is going to learn again and again, that we're going to have to accept limited options and limited war. be accepted here in Korea with what is essentially a stalemate. We will accept it in Vietnam. We can't go nuclear in Vietnam because that might lead the Soviets to go nuclear on us. All right. So, with the threat of a nuclear annihilation, total victory is impossible, and so we have a limited war. The Korean War will continue to drag on until 1953. A couple of things will help. Stalin dying will be very helpful to ending the Korean War. And in 1953, an armistice will be signed between the two Koreas, which technically is still in place. Technically, the two Koreas are still at war with each other. They've never signed the peace treaty. They've only signed an armistice. Impacts of the Korean War are many. Okay. First of all, introducing the concept of limited war into containment. Okay. Nuclear weapons prevent total victory. Bypassing Congress to wage war on presidential authority alone. That is something we are also going to see over and over again, and still see over and over again to this day. South Korea was a dictatorship, okay? But it was an anti-communist dictatorship. And so the United States was willing to look the other way when the dick part of dictatorship reared its head. There will not be free elections in South Korea for decades. And we're going to see this again, that American policymakers will be willing to look the other way as long as a dictator is enthusiastically anti-communist. We'll see it in Vietnam. We will see it a lot in Iran, Iraq, the Pinochet regime in Chile, Saddam Hussein, the Shah of Iran, all kinds of places. If you are enthusiastically anti-communist, we will look the other way when you act like a dick in your dictatorship. Reinforced NSC 68, so all of those recommendations hit because of Korea. Hydrogen bomb, increasing the size of the army, taxes, propaganda, military security pacts. American troops unable to tell friend from foe in a civil war. Something we'll see again in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, all sorts of fun, happy places. So that is the Korean War. Very short lecture, but a very important war because so many things that we're going to see for the rest of the Cold War and beyond, even up until today, a A lot of this is still part of American foreign policy to this day. And so it is a very important war. In the next lecture, we are going to look at how all of this anti-communism and foreign policy is affecting domestic policy. And that is going to introduce us to the second Red Scare, this one led by Senator Joe McCarthy. So I will see you in that next video.